Today's lesson is about communication process and principles of communication. Across the different topics, these are the expected learning outcomes. Explain and identify the nature of communication, its process, elements, and principles. Analyze the principles and apply these in real life communication, and identify moral and ethical grounds of dispositions in communicative interactions. What is communication? It is a mistake to believe that communication is a simple process because we cannot simply know that in communication we should talk or communicate. Although people communicate with one another every day, the real question is whether the ideas one has expressed are truly understood by another. Effective communication can reach peace, spark revolutions, and affect change. However, to communicate properly, one cannot simply strive to express oneself and leave understanding to fate. One must also learn how to organize one's thoughts, control one's emotion, use one's words to articulate concepts and arguments, and express oneself in the best way possible. In this lesson, you will find out that there are different concepts in communicating, and it's important to be an ethical communicator. Communication comes from the Latin word communis, which means commons. To be common means to come together or to commune. That is, to share something in common. Communication is the process of exchanging ideas, thoughts, feelings, and emotions from one person to another with the use of symbols which may be verbal and or nonverbal and aims for understanding and remembering. But why study communication? Studying communication can improve self-knowledge and self-perception because most self-knowledge comes to us through communication. It can improve how we see others as communication is the way we meet others, develop and manage relationships, and work effectively with others. It can increase our understanding of relationships. It can develop important life skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, conflict resolution, team building, and public speaking. It can help you succeed professionally, creating strong oral and written messages, working well with others, managing your image, researching, analyzing, and solving problems are key abilities employers look for. And it can help you exercise your rights and become an effective citizen. In order to explain the social process of communication, scholars have developed several models. The three most well-known models for communication are linear, interactional, and transactional. As West and Turner 2021 explain, each model sheds light on the development of communication but emphasizes different parts of the communication process. Originally developed by Shannon and Weaver in 1948, the model describes communication as a linear process. This model describes how a sender transmits a message to a receiver or listener. More specifically, The sender is the source of the message. A message may consist of the sounds, words, or behaviors in a communication interaction. The message itself is transmitted through a channel, the pathway or route for communication, to a receiver, who is the target or recipient of the message. There may be obstacles in the communication process or noise. Noise refers to any interference in the channel or distortion of the message. This is a fairly simple model in which a message is simply passed from sender to receiver. While the linear model was highly influential during the mid-20th century, this model is perhaps too simple. There are limitations if you pause to think of the beliefs about communication or assumptions made in this model. First, this model assumes that communication only goes in one direction. Here, a person can be a sender or receiver, but not both. This is problematic because communication in action is more dynamic than the linear model suggests. In action, communication involves a give and take between senders and receivers, in which listeners are not simply passive receptacles for a sender's message. This model is also limited because it provides only one channel for only one message. Finally, it implies that messages themselves are clear-cut with a distinct beginning and a distinct end. However, communication is not as neat and tidy as a linear model would suggest. In the move to a more dynamic view of communication, interactional models follow two channels in which communication and feedback flow between sender and receiver. Feedback is simply a response that gives a receiver a chance to respond to the sender. It can be verbal, like a yes, or nonverbal, like nod or smile. Most importantly, feedback indicates comprehension. It can help senders know if their message was received and understood. By focusing on flow and feedback, interactional models view communication as an ongoing process. The final feature of this model is the field of experience. The field of experience refers to how environment, experiences, culture, and even heredity can influence how a sender constructs a message. Each person brings a unique field of experience to an interaction. Likewise, each communication interaction is unique. While the interactional model is more dynamic than the linear model, it still contains some limitations. For instance, this model implies that while people can be both senders and receivers, they cannot do so simultaneously. The transactional is the most dynamic of communication models. One notable feature of this model is the move from referring to people as senders and receivers to referring to people as communicators. This implies that communication is achieved as people both send and receive messages. The model views communication as a transaction, meaning communication is cooperative action in which communicators co-create the process, outcome, and effectiveness of the interaction. Unlike the linear model in which meaning is sent from one person to another, Also, unlike the interactional model in which understanding is achieved through feedback, people create shared meaning in a more dynamic process in the transactional model. This model also places more emphasis on the field of experience. Communicators must share at least some degree of overlap in culture, language, or environment if people are to communicate at all. This model also recognizes that messages will influence the responses or subsequent messages produced in the communication interaction. This means that messages do not stand alone, but instead are interrelated. The principle of interrelation states that messages are connected to build upon one another. The transactional model forms the basis for much communication theory because people are viewed as dynamic communicators rather than simple senders or receivers. There must be some overlap in field of experience in order to build shared meaning, and messages are interdependent. Communication helps us to navigate our lives. However, we assume that everyone sees the world through our eyes and experiences. This can lead to misinterpretation, disagreements, and confusion. The following are some of the principles of communication based on the most common misconceptions in business communication. Communication happens when messages are sent. Sometimes people assume that because they have sent a message, it has been received, and that receiving a message is the same as understanding it. Think about the unread messages in your inbox, the promotion, update, or social mails that go directly into spam or trash bins. Most messages never get to their intended audience. Communication probably happens when you hear an answer or see an outcome that confirms it. This is especially true when it comes to social media. Thousands of posts don't mean thousands of views, much less that people have understood or engaged with your content. Fluency means comprehension. Proficiency in a language is not the only measurement of your effectiveness in communicating. If that were true, then someone with a large vocabulary need not listen. Ensure that messages were actually heard, understood, or retained. If you have written an academic paper, you know that a deep understanding of a topic is no assurance of the ability to communicate about it effectively. One reason this happens is that you can get into the habit of using the jargon or abbreviations that are well known to those in the field but become a barrier to those outside of it. If people don't agree with you, then they misunderstood. Overconfidence in the truth of your message can sometimes result in an assumption that everyone will agree with you. Think about how often political convictions can result in disputes among friends. Sometimes people hear your message just fine, but they simply don't agree with you. This is not necessarily a prompt to restate, repeat, or say it louder. It can be a prompt to rethink. One message fits all. If all humans had identical needs, experiences, and aspirations, perhaps one type of communication would be feasible. Since we have unique needs, then we have to tailor communications to match our various audiences. Not only do people learn and understand things in different ways, they have different expectations and priorities. By keeping communication styles responsive and flexible, you will be better at getting your message delivered. Any problem can be resolved with effective communications. Communication is not magic. There are some challenges that communications simply will not overcome. In some situations, the best that communications can do is facilitate interpersonal exchanges and help to make the position of both sides clear. The more communications, the better. Whether you are talking about interpersonal communications or the media, more is not necessarily better. Balance is important. Measure your responses. Take the temperature of your audience to determine if your message is getting through. Communication is easy. Just because everyone does it doesn't mean they do it well. While most people can learn to be better communicators with time and practice, good communications take work. Communicating effectively with broad and diverse audiences requires research, skill, and knowledge. These were my sources. Thank you.